Hello YouTube and welcome to the next route learning video and the first route learning video that I will have done in a steam locomotive. On today's journey we're going to be travelling between Dumfries and Carlisle on the Western Lines of Scotland route, which will actually form the return journey for the Carlisle to Dumfries run on the West Coast Main Line over Shap route in a Class 156, which I made a little while ago. So our traction is going to be a Black 5 and the scenario is Thames Clyde Express, which I believe comes with the route. The reason why I have chosen the Black 5, apart from the fact that this locomotive comes with the route, is simply because it actually has a speedometer, unlike many of the steam locomotives out there. But in addition to that, you can actually see out the front when you're driving along, something that you can't do in many steam locos. And indeed in many locos you actually have to put your head out the window to see where you're going, which isn't very useful if you need to be able to see the speedometer. On the way we will be calling at Annan. The Black 5 was designed by William Stanier and built at multiple locations. They were built between 1934 and 1951, with a total of 842 of these locomotives produced. The wheel configuration is in the 460 arrangement, with the driving wheel diameter being 6 feet. The maximum coal capacity is 9 tonnes, with a water capacity of 4,000 gallons. The maximum boiler pressure is 225 pounds per square inch, and the maximum tractive effort is 25,455 pounds of force. The Black 5 locomotives were withdrawn between 1961 and 1968, with a total of 18 preserved, and the entire remaining 800 plus locomotives were scrapped. Once in the cab of a steam locomotive, you can see just how different it is from the cab of a modern diesel or electric locomotive, and indeed you can see that there's a lot of mechanical controls, a lot which do different things. In this video I'm only going to talk about the controls which pertain to actually driving the loco, as the automatic fireman is turned on. In real life you certainly wouldn't have the driver also doing the firing at the same time, so I do believe it's more realistic to have the automatic fireman turned on, though you can certainly in Train Simulator drive with manual firing, where you also operate the water and the coal and decide how much to put in. I won't be going through that today, but if there is enough interest I will consider making a steam and firing driving tutorial in the future, so do let me know in the comments if that interests you. I'm certainly not as knowledgeable with steam locomotives as I am with more modern trains, so do please bear with me if I do get things wrong, and again I'm happy to take constructive criticism if something I say isn't quite right or you see that I'm doing something not quite right, so that I can hopefully improve my driving technique in the future. So the first control that we're going to look at is down here to the left of the driver's side, which is the cylinder cock lever, which you can see just in the middle of the screen now. Now the cylinder cocks, what they do is prevent water from building up in the cylinders to stop them ultimately from blowing up. Normally you would open the cylinder cocks when you've been stopped for around 5 minutes, I believe it is. I'm not sure how long we've been stopped here, so I've opened them already. And normally you would close the cylinder cocks after around 5 to 10 revolutions of the wheel. That being said, if you find that you're getting a bit of wheel slip, which we may do on this journey today, you can leave them open for a little longer, and it may be that I leave these cylinder cocks open until we're doing 5 or 10 miles per hour. The next control that we're going to look at is the cut-off valve. In more modern trains this would be basically the reverser. However, the cut-off on a steam locomotive operates very differently to the reverser on a more modern locomotive or unit. So what we need to do first of all is move it all of the way to the forward position, but there are actually varied positions between neutral and forward, and indeed if you were to move it that way with the S key you'd actually move it into the reverse position. So I'm just going to keep my finger on W until it's all the way to the forward position. And now at this point, this would be forward at 75% on the HUD. The best way I can explain how to operate this and what it does is think of the gears in a car. Although this locomotive doesn't have gears, as we increase in speed, we have to gradually pull the reversing lever back, or the cut-off valve should I say back, towards the centre position. However, you don't want to drop it to lower than around 20%, which in this case, just to show you, would be to move it to around this point here. So I'm going to move it back to the 75% now, and you'll see as I accelerate I will start to move the reversing handle towards the centre position. It will allow the train to go faster, but in addition to that it will also make the train more economical with the fuel. In front of us here we have the brake lever. With the Black 5 there is only a train brake, there is no independent locomotive brake. And as with all steam locomotives, as far as I'm aware, the brakes are in fact vacuum brakes rather than air brakes, so they operate a little differently. And indeed, how far you move the brake handle dictates how fast the brakes will apply, and you need to move the brake handle back to the hold position to hold the train at a certain brake force, which is the same way as the Class 111 DMU brakes worked on the Western Lines of Scotland video that I did in that unit. So if we look up here now, you can see the brake gauge, and when the brakes are fully released the needle will be pointing to 21, which is 21 inches HG. So if I now move the brake handle to the released position, you can now see that the pressure slowly increases and it will slowly climb to 21, the needle. If at any point I would like to hold the brakes at a certain brake force, I could then just move the brakes to the hold position, and you can see it's holding the needle there. If I would now like to reapply the brakes, say to drop the needle to 5, which would be around 3/4 of the total brake force, if I now move the brake handle to the apply position, you can see how I'm controlling the speed of the application by moving the handle there. And now if I move it back to hold, we will hold the brakes at the 5 on the brake gauge. In front of us here we have the speedometer, which is pretty self-explanatory. It is measured in miles per hour and goes up to 75 miles per hour. I believe we may be able to achieve 70, maybe slightly above on this journey today. We'll see how I do with balancing the regulator and the cut-off valve. The lever in front of us is the sanding lever, which again is quite self-explanatory for anyone who knows much about railways. But basically, if you're struggling to get grip on the rails, if you then press X, you can see the sanding lever moves up there, and that will dump sand onto the track under the wheels. And this helps the train to have more grip with metal wheels on metal rails, and helps the train to either accelerate or brake a bit quicker, and help to prevent wheel slip, though it's not always fully successful in doing so. Above us is the whistle, and if you press spacebar you can sound it. The lever that you can see in front of us in the middle of the screen, which I will operate here, is very much like the throttle in a diesel or electric locomotive. However, it works quite differently. So the name of this lever in a steam locomotive is called a regulator, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of. And what this does is it regulates or controls the amount of steam going into the cylinders. So I have just pulled the regulator back to off for the moment. So there are two valves on the regulator, and if you move it between 0 and around 50%, halfway, then you're on the first valve, and then between 51 and 100% you're on the second valve. And if what I understand is correct, it's actually more fuel economic to move the regulator into second valve at 52%, for example, than it is to run it high in first valve at 48%. The gauge that you can see in the middle of the screen here is one of the most important gauges in the cab, and I will need to keep checking this throughout the journey. If you had the F4 HUD on, you'll actually be able to see what this gauge is reading, because this is the boiler pressure gauge, with the boiler pressure measured in pounds per square inch. And so this gauge can climb up to 225, the needle there, and then what will happen is, as the boiler pressure reaches that, the loco will then blow off to let out steam, which you can actually see the needle is falling as it's doing that now, to between 215 and 220 psi. This is to ensure that the boiler pressure doesn't get too high and consequently blow up the boiler. So one of the key things to do when driving a steam train is balance out how much steam you're using to keep the boiler pressure as high as you can. It's okay to lose a little bit of boiler pressure, especially if you've got an uphill section, as long as you know that there will be a point to recover at some point in a short distance. What will happen is, as the boiler pressure needle falls, the locomotive will become less powerful. It won't be able to pull as hard, and consequently you'll find yourself slowing down more. And if the boiler pressure falls too far, I'm not sure what the PSI would be for this, you will then find that the brakes actually won't be able to be kept off, because there's not enough boiler pressure to do so, and consequently the brakes will automatically apply themselves and stop the train, completely stalling you until the boiler pressure has built back up again. So the way to control boiler pressure is by using the right amount of regulator to the right amount of cutoff, which we've already looked at. I'll explain this in more detail as we're driving along. I know that some of these concepts probably sound initially very complicated, but once you've seen it in action, I think you'll see it's not quite as difficult as it first sounds. So I think that's pretty much everything that we really need to cover in the cab for now. And so in a moment we will depart from Dumfries. I'm just going to pan to a couple of cutaway shots first, and then we'll depart and head towards Carlisle. Now that it's time to depart from Dumfries, I'm just going to move the brake handle to the release position, and now you'll see that the needle will slowly start increasing. Indeed, you can see that it's quite slow on the Black 5, the increase in the needle up towards the 21 position. And as we now reach around 15 on the brake gauge, I'm now going to open the regulator and allow the train to start moving. And if you do that before the brakes are fully released, it should make for a smoother start off than if you actually wait until the brakes are fully released before you apply the regulator. I'm already going to move the reversing handle back to the first horizontal position there, or should I say the cut-off, not the reversing handle. And as you can see, it's now in the horizontal position, which is roughly 65%. And as I open the regulator, I now need to listen out for wheel slip, just to ensure that the train doesn't slip, which can damage both the wheels and the track. As the Steam Sound Supreme sound pack is installed on this locomotive, you will notice the sound of wheel slip, which you may not notice on the default loco. In fact, I don't think it's simulated properly on the default Black 5. I am now going to shut the cylinder cocks as we've reached around 10 miles per hour. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't getting any wheel slip as we are in some snow here. In fact, you've just probably heard some wheel slip there. So I've just shut the regulator off for a moment. I'm moving the cutoff back further to now the vertical position, which is around 50 to 52%. I'm now going to open the regulator once again and try and ensure that we don't get any more wheel slip. So I am going to increase slowly and gently, and as soon as I can, I'd like to get into the second valve. Now opening the regulator a bit more. Once the tip of the regulator is pointing just above the brake handle, we're then in second valve at just over 50%. I'm now going to move the cutoff further back still. And in fact, I'm going to move it to the next horizontal position, which is around 36 to 38%. Gradually we will keep moving it back further until we manage to move it back to around 20%. And you wouldn't want to pull it back to more than that, as you would then find that the locomotive would start cutting out. I know it's I think it would in real life, should I say. I'm not sure if the physics are fully simulated in Train Simulator. So we are now well into second valve. I'd estimate that we're around 60% regulator at this point. We are doing around 30 miles per hour. So I am now going to cut the cut-off valve back further. And at this point, just right of the vertical position, the cutoff is now around 25 to 27%. I'm going to continue opening the regulator a bit more now. But I am also going to check on the boiler pressure to make sure that we aren't losing too much. As you can see, we are at around 215, so there's no cause for concern at present. But I do need to keep an eye on that. If we do lose too much boiler pressure, I will have to further adjust the cutoff and regulator settings. What I'm going to do now as we approach 40 miles per hour is in fact cut the regulator to just above the brake handle, which should be at around 52% now, the regulator, and cut the cutoff back to just left of the vertical position, which is around 20 to 22%. This is probably the most fuel economic way to drive from this point, and the train will gradually continue to accelerate, and with the way that the timetable is constructed, we should be able to arrive at Annan on time. We should be able to get to between 60 and 70 miles per hour between here and Annan, so we will be able to travel at a reasonable speed on the way. And for the moment I can now put my head out of the window, just because I can be sure that we're not going to break the speed limit, and I believe that we've got the regulator and cutoff in a good position to prevent us from losing too much boiler pressure. One thing I did notice with this scenario is that the season is set to spring, the weather is set to snow, and we've got some snow falling, but I'm not quite sure where it's coming from, because there appears to be no clouds above us. One of the many problems I think with the default weather engine in Train Simulator is that it can indeed rain or snow from a completely blue sky with clouds a long way in the distance, which I just don't quite think would happen in real life. So I am now going to get into the cab and just check what's happening with the boiler pressure. As you can see, we've got no cause for concern there. In fact, it climbs to around 220 by the looks of it, so the boiler pressure is increasing. And if we look at the speedometer, we are now doing around 50 miles per hour and continuing to accelerate. Though, as I've already mentioned, we won't be accelerating especially quickly. There are no major speed changes between here and Annan, and the only speed change that we will encounter will be just before Annan station, where there will be a drop in the speed limit to 45 miles per hour. Once again, checking the boiler pressure, as it's always wise to do, and as you can see, we're still hovering at around 220 with no real loss. So it seems that with the cut-off at around 20% and the regulator around 52%, we're going to manage to maintain the boiler pressure most of the way. The only time we'll probably lose a little bit of boiler pressure now is when water is actually being added to the boiler. As that happens, you do then find that boiler pressure gets lost a bit. However, once water is stopped being added to the boiler, so once the fireman turns it off again, you will often find that the boiler pressure will start to increase. So temporary decreases in the boiler pressure aren't really anything to worry about. As you probably just saw, one of the many things I don't like about Train Simulator, a very blocky and blobby tree there, which I don't think looked particularly nice at all. Very 2D and pixelated. I believe that the station we're now passing through is Rax. Once again, going back into the cab to see how we're doing, and as you can see, our speed has now increased to 60 miles per hour and is still continuing to increase. I believe in real life these locomotives are restricted to 60 miles per hour, but I'm not sure that in Steam days they were quite so strict with speeds, especially if the line speed is higher, and indeed, as already mentioned, the line speed is 75 miles per hour here. In fact, no, I don't think I mentioned that, but as we departed from Dumfries, the speed limit did go up to 75 miles per hour. I don't actually remember pointing it out. but we were doing well under the speed limit when we passed the 75 board, so it didn't really affect us in any way, and we didn't have to reduce speed before we passed that board. One of the things that you will notice about this section of track is just how straight it is, and I think there may only even be just 1 or 2 curves between here and Annan. The section between Annan and Carlisle is more curvy, especially as we have to curve to join onto the West Coast main line. The main differences on this route between this version and the version on West Coast Main Line over Shap is that this is based in the 1950s, and the West Coast Main Line over Shap version is based in the 1970s, I believe it is. So sections of this route have indeed been singled at that point, although I believe they have now been redoubled again in real life. And indeed most of the stations that we pass through on this route are open, but on the West Coast Main Line over Shap route are closed. Though again, I believe that some of the stations have now been reopened again, one of them being Gretna Green. I'm now going to go back into the cab to check how we're doing, and if we look down here you can see that we are getting closer to 70 miles per hour now, doing around 68 miles per hour, and if we check the steam pressure once again we are at around 220 psi, so we haven't really lost any boiler pressure at all, and we're continuing to run okay. The biggest issue that I think most people have in Train Simulator when they first try driving a steam locomotive is keeping that boiler pressure up and preventing the train from stalling. I know that on some locomotives it is certainly more difficult to drive than on others, and some locomotives are much easier to stall than others. One scenario I'm particularly thinking of is on the Meardy Valley route, where you're driving a little J94 austerity tank which is only got 4 driving wheels, and you have to haul a 20 or 30 wagon train, depending on your choice, up a steep hill to the other end of the route, and it's just so easy to stall on that route, and I find it incredibly difficult to manage to do that scenario, especially in the time given. If any of you managed to complete that scenario, please let me know, because I'd be really interested to hear it, because I've just found it absolutely impossible to do myself. The station that we have just passed through is Ruthwell Station, and we now have 7 miles to go to Annan. Once again getting back into the cab to see how we're doing. As you can see we are now doing a comfortable 70 miles per hour, which should get us to Annan in plenty of time. The boiler pressure is between 215 and 220, so no cause for concern at all, which means we can just continue to drive, leaving the train in the same settings, and look back out of the window. So yes, another thing to point out is in regards to balancing the boiler pressure, I think the biggest issue people have is the use of the regulator, and they often think that they need to have it on a really high setting to get the train to move fast, but that's not necessarily the case, as you can see here. And while if I opened it more I might be able to get a little more speed out of it, doing it this way allows me to get the maximum possible speed without stalling the train. now once again getting back into the loco, as I like to keep doing from time to time to check on everything. We're still doing around 70 miles per hour, though we may lose a little bit of speed here as we are on a slight incline. And the boiler pressure has indeed fallen now to 210 and may fall a little more yet. I believe that at this point the fireman is likely adding water to the boiler. If it drops below 200 to maybe 195 or less, at that point I feel is a cause for concern, and I'll then try and do more about it, as we shouldn't need to lose that much boiler pressure on this section of the route with the shallow gradients that we're on. The station that we've just passed through was Dumfries station, and at that point we had 3.5 miles to go to our stop. So what we're looking for now is to count signals as we leave Dumfries station behind. And so at the first signal after Dumfries station, we've then got 2.5 miles to go to Annan. And at the second signal after Dumfries station, we've then got 1.5 miles to go to our stop, and 1 mile to go to a speed change, which is a reduction down to 45 miles per hour. So we've just passed the first signal past Dumfries, and once we reach the second signal, at that point I am then going to cut off the regulator, and then shortly after that I am going to apply the brakes down to 10 on the brake gauge, which should be about right. So as soon as we can see the next signal, I'm then going to get back into the cab, ready to cut off the regulator and prepare to brake. We will need to brake from inside the cab so that I can see how hard the brakes have been applied. I can now see the second signal after Dumfries just coming up, so I am now getting back into the cab. And just as we approach the signal in a moment, which we have done now, I'm now cutting the regulator off completely. As you can hear, the locomotive has now gone a lot quieter, and at this point I'm now going to start applying the brakes. Probably applied them slightly quicker than I planned there, and the brakes are now in the 10 position on the brake gauge, and I'm also going to start opening the cutoff just a bit more. And as you can see, our speed is falling off quite nicely now, and we're dropping down towards 50 miles per hour. As I mentioned, there is a 45 mile per hour speed limit upcoming. We're now doing 50. I'm just going to see if I can see the 45 coming up. I can't quite, but at this point I am now going to release the brakes, as we will slow down to just a bit below 45 miles per hour due to the slow release of the brakes on this locomotive. The speed limit is now down to 45 just after this signal here, should I say, and we've got around half a mile to go now to Annan station. And so as we enter this right hand curve just here, I am now reapplying the brakes to bring our speed down further, and I'm going to open the cutoff more as well. And so we're now at around 12 on the brake gauge, and I'm going to try and hold us at that momentarily, because I think that should be bringing our speed down quick enough. I'm once again going to look outside. As you can see, the platform's not quite come up on us yet, though I do want to aim to enter the platform at no faster than around 20 miles per hour. I am releasing the brakes momentarily down to 15, as you can see now on the brake gauge there, which will enable us to slow down more slowly. You can now see the platform coming up, so I'm going to release the brakes completely, as I do feel we possibly slowed down there just slightly too early. And so we're cruising along at 20, and I'm now going to apply the brakes once again, initially to 15, and then I'll increase them if necessary as we come towards the end of the platform. As you see, we're now doing around 15 miles per hour, I believe. We do need to stop with the loco just slightly beyond the end of the platform, and so I'll be looking to do that in a moment. As soon as the cab has passed under the bridge that you can see ahead, that is roughly the correct stopping place to try and fit as much of this train in as possible. Certainly if we stop with the loco in the platform, the whole train will not fit. And so I have now moved the brakes down to 10, releasing slightly, and we should now be stopped in about the right place. Once again, departing from Annan, I have opened the regulator before the brakes were fully released to try and give a smooth start off. And departing from here, the starting speed limit is 50 miles per hour, and we've got around 17 3/4 miles to go to the next and final stop, which is Carlisle. I have now moved the brake handle back to the hold position, which should hopefully try and save a bit on the steam. And I'm already cutting the cut-off back, so I've cut it back to 65% initially as I open the regulator a bit more. I did open the cylinder cocks initially to try and ensure that we didn't get any wheel slip, and indeed it appears that we didn't. So at this point I'm just going to open the regulator more, and if I hear wheel slip at any point I will then cut it back. I am now going to pull the cut-off back further, and so once again we're at now the first vertical position that it goes to after it's at the full open position. So at this point we're around 50 to 52% cut-off. I've now opened the regulator into second valve. This should enable us to be more fuel efficient and hopefully accelerate just a bit quicker. I'm going to pull the cut-off back still further in a moment to allow the train to continue to accelerate. The next position that I will pull it back to is the next 90-degree angle, so that it's facing horizontal once again. And if you remember, at that point we're at around 36 to 38% open on the cutoff. So I have now pulled it back to the next horizontal position. You probably heard the loco quieten down just a bit. And I haven't really pulled the regulator open all that far yet, so I am just going to open it a bit more now to around 70%. Really, that's around 70 to 75% at this point. Possibly even up towards 80 actually, though I don't want to open it fully as I just don't see any need to. I'm now going to pull the cut-off back still further as we are approaching now 35 miles per hour. So we're now just to the right of the next vertical position, meaning that we're around 25 to 27% cut-off now, allowing us to continue to accelerate further. And as you may have just noticed, we've just passed a 75 mile per hour speed board, so the speed limit has now gone back up to 75 miles per hour. As you can probably see, we're now doing around 45 miles per hour, so I'm just going to pull the cut-off back now to around 20%. I'm going to decrease the regulator as I did before to around 52 to 54% regulator, which is where the tip of the regulator is just above the brake gauge. At this point now, we should once again be in the same settings as we were before, which is, as you probably noticed, as you noticed before, quite fuel efficient, and indeed we can maintain the boiler pressure at quite a high level. In fact, it looks like that the boiler has just been blowing off, possibly due to having reached almost 225. It's either just blown off, or it will do soon if the boiler pressure goes up any more. Once again, at this point, I now feel able to go outside and have a look, because I know that the train won't be able to break the speed limit. And indeed, the speed board that you just saw there was a warning for a 30 mile per hour speed restriction for trains crossing the point to the right. However, that speed limit won't be affecting us. We're now passing through East Riggs Station, which means we've got around 6 miles to go to Gretna Junction, where we cross into England and also join the West Coast Main Line. So I'm now getting back into the cab just to check that everything's okay. So our speed is coming up towards 60 miles per hour now, and our boiler pressure is maintaining just below 225. In fact, it looks like it's climbing and it's probably going to blow off around now. So as you can see, we've got no problems with the boiler pressure once again. As we approach Gretna Junction and Gretna Green Station, there will be a speed drop down to 40 miles per hour. In fact, the speed drop is just before the platform at Gretna Green Station. And then after joining the West Coast Main Line, speed limit will go up to 90 miles per hour. Though there's absolutely no way that we will be able to reach that before we have to slow down for Carlisle. And indeed, I'm not even sure if this locomotive would be capable of getting to 90 miles per hour with the load that it's currently hauling. I don't know if it'll be able to light loco either, though it's probably a lot more likely than hauling. I think we've got 8, 9, possibly even 10 coaches behind us. So this is actually certainly a lot for the Black 5 to haul, and that's why this particular locomotive does accelerate very slowly, but it can get to a surprisingly good speed on these gradients. So just to check our speed now, we are doing around 62 miles per hour and continuing to accelerate, and the boiler pressure is still at just below 225 psi. We're now passing the closed station at Rig. So what we're looking out for along here now is a 40 limit warning board. I don't believe that speed warning boards were in existence in the 1950s, but they have been added to this route as a speed board with a yellow triangle on it. At that point, as soon as we pass the board, I'm then going to cut off the regulator and brake. And once again, we'll brake to around 10 on the brake gauge. I believe I can now see the speed warning just coming up. Indeed, so I have just cut off the regulator and I am now applying the brakes to bring the needle down towards the 10. And as you can see, the needle is now approaching the 10, so I've just moved the brake handle to the hold position, and this should bring our speed off quite nicely. I will reopen the cut-off a little. In fact, I'm going to open it to the horizontal position once again, which is 36 to 38% cut-off. As you can see, we're now down to 50 miles per hour, and so the speed limit will be dropping to 40 just before the platform at Gretna Green Station that you can see just coming up there. As we are now approaching 40, we're doing around 42 miles per hour. I'm now just going to release the brakes fully, and we're probably going to slow down to around 37, 38 miles per hour. So I'm just going to open the regulator very slightly, and I'm going to stay in the cab at this point so that I can monitor our speed as we turn towards the West Coast Main Line. And so Gretna Green Station just coming up here, and we've just now passed the 40 mile per hour speed board. now passing through Gretna Green Station, and in a moment we've got a long sweeping right curve to take as we turn towards the West Coast Main Line. I have just cut the regulator a bit so that we can look outside for a moment, just so that we can see the curve coming up and see the line coming up. Just cutting the regulator a little more now to try and ensure that we don't end up breaking the speed limit, as we can't currently see the speedometer. In fact, we've slowed down a little too much there. We've slowed down to around 35, so I have just opened the regulator a little once again. Possibly slightly too much, so I'm just hauling it back slightly there. And in a moment the West Coast Main Line should come into sight. Once we've crossed Gretna Junction, we've then got around, I believe it's 7 miles to go to Carlisle. Just got back into the cab to keep an eye on our speed. You can see we have now crawled up towards 40 miles per hour, so I'm just hauling back on the accelerator slightly. And as you can see, we're now joining the tracks of the West Coast Main Line. So the tracks joining us from the left do lead up to Glasgow Central, and indeed I have covered that route in the Carlisle to Glasgow Central route video, should I say. So we're now back in England, and the speed limit has gone up to 90 miles per hour. So at this point I'm now going to open the regulator and pull the cutoff back to around 25%, sorry to say 20%, because it's slightly left of the vertical position. I'm now opening the regulator up to the second valve once again, and hopefully we should be able to get our speed back up fairly quickly. At this point now I feel able to look outside the locomotive once again to see the upcoming scenery much more clearly than you can from within the cab. And so gradually as we get towards Carlisle, we will see a decrease in the speed limit that will be in steps. So initially the speed limit will drop to 75 miles per hour, and then it will drop to 60, and then 40, and then finally 20 miles per hour on the approaches to Carlisle station. So what I'm looking out for along here in a few minutes time will indeed be the 75 mile per hour speed limit board. We won't be able to get to 75 before we enter the 75 speed zone, but at that point that then marks that we're 2/3 of a mile away from the 60 mile per hour speed restriction just after, which we may need to brake slightly for. In fact, let's just get into the cab now and see how fast we're going. We are currently doing around 53 to 54 miles per hour and continuing to accelerate. I believe that we may be able to get to between 65 and 70 before we have to start thinking about slowing down for the upcoming 60 mile per hour speed limit. So I'm going to look outside once again. As soon as we do get to the 75 mile per hour speed board, I will check our speed, come back into the cab and cut off the regulator, and then if necessary I will brake at the next signal, which will be just before the 60 mile per hour speed limit. Just once again going to get in the cab now just to check our speed. We're now getting up to just towards 60 miles per hour. Estimate we're doing around 57 to 58, and the boiler pressure is absolutely fine there. So we have no causes for concern, and so just going to continue to drive and look out for the upcoming 75 mile per hour speed limit. I believe that the track's now diverging off to the right. You probably just noticed there. I believe that that will be going into Carlisle Kingmore Yard, and I believe there will also be a track from the left of us just here which will also diverge into Carlisle Kingmore Yard. I believe that the track, as it is now diverging to the left, is now diverging towards Kingmore Yard. And so in a short distance time we should now be seeing the 75 mile per hour speed restriction. And so I'm looking out for that now, ready to cut off the regulator as soon as I see it. We're now passing through Rockcliffe Station, which is another closed station on this route. Just once again going to check on our speed. Indeed, we've now managed to reach around 70 miles per hour, so we should actually need to brake for the upcoming 60 very soon. I think that might be either the 75 or the 75 warning board coming up. Indeed, that was the warning board. So once we pass the actual 75 board, as I've already mentioned, with 2/3 of a mile then from the upcoming 60 mile per hour speed limit, I can now see the 75 board just coming up. So at this point I have now cut off the regulator, and I am going to apply the brakes as we pass the next signal just coming up now. So we're now reaching that signal and I am applying the brakes. I'm going to move them to around 12 or 13 on the brake gauge, just to ensure that we slow down in time, though it looks like we have now slowed to 60. So I am now releasing the brakes, and I'm going to look outside once again, try and look out for the 60 mile per hour speed board. The 60 mile per hour speed board should be coming up any second now, and it looks like that I can see it just here. And indeed, so at this point we're now 3/4 of a mile from the next speed limit, which is a 40 mile per hour speed limit. And once again I'm going to brake for that at the next signal. So at this point I'm just going to allow the train to continue to coast and open the cut-off a bit, and then as we reach the next signal, at that point I'm then going to apply the brakes down to 10, and in fact you can see that we're now passing the next signal just here. So I'm applying the brakes down to 10 on the brake gauge to try and make sure that our speed is down to 40 in time. Brakes are now in the hold position, and you can see we're now down to 50, 45, we're coming up to 40 miles per hour very quickly. So I'm now going to release the brakes at just above 40, as we should then be slowed down to 40 miles per hour in time. The 40 mile per hour speed limit is then half a mile from the final speed reduction, which is a reduction down to 20 miles per hour. And so I'm going to brake for that. I'm going to brake to around 12 to 13 on the brake gauge, just as we pass this tall signal box on the left here. As you can see, we're passing it now, so I am applying the brakes to bring them to around 12 or 13 on the brake gauge. I think I'm going to aim probably 13 there and just hold the brakes in this position, and this should slow us down to 20 in time, I believe. In fact, I'm just going to go slightly harder just to ensure that we do indeed slow down in time. We're now down to 30 miles per hour, and in a moment the speed limit will be dropping to 20 just as we enter this area here. We're now doing 25, and the 20 mile per hour speed board I believe is just coming up, so we have slowed down slightly too much there, and I'm just opening the cut-off a bit, so we're around at this point 50%, and applying a little bit of regulator to ensure that we don't slow down too much. We've now entered the 20 mph speed zone. I'm going to have to drive from the cab just so I can keep an eye on how fast we're going. I've now cut the regulator right back again so that we are now coasting. Here at Carlisle, we do need to aim to stop at the end of the platform roughly, to be stopped in the right place to fit all the train in, and also I believe get all the train under the roof. So we just want to make sure that as much of the train is under the roof as possible, which means stopping just before the signal at the end of the platform here at Carlisle. We have now slowed down to around 18 mph, so I've just opened the regulator slightly just to ensure that we don't lose too much speed. As you can see, we are now entering Carlisle station. So I'm looking outside momentarily just to pinpoint where we are, and then once we're in the platform I'll then go back into the cab and we'll gently start slowing down for the end of the platform. I'm just cutting off the regulator once again. And as you can see, we're now entering the platform here at Carlisle Citadel station. The platform's just to our left. I believe it was one of those two that I departed from on the Carlisle to Dumfries class 156 video. So as a result of this, I have now done this route in both directions, though in different time periods and modelled slightly differently, and also indeed with different speed limits. So I am now applying the brakes, and I'm bringing us down to 15 on the brake gauge, just to see what happens and how quickly we do slow down. As you can see, we are now down to around 10 mph. I believe now I can actually release the brakes once again, possibly hold them at just around 18 there, just to continue bringing our speed off very slowly as we come towards the end of the platform here at Carlisle. I have now released the brakes completely, just to ensure that we don't stop too early. I'm going to aim to stop by the water point just here, just before the signal. So I am now going to apply some braking, bring us down to around 15, which should bring us to a fairly gentle stop here. So we're now holding the brakes at 15. And now that we're fully stopped, I'm now going to put the brakes into full. Thank you very, very much for watching. I really do hope that you've enjoyed the video and enjoyed the difference of looking at driving a steam locomotive rather than a more modern diesel electric, and seen the different challenges and different techniques involved in driving one of these. Please don't forget that you can find me on Facebook, the link of which is in the description of this video. And also, please don't forget that if you really do value the work that I do and would like to financially support me towards the cost of DLC or new equipment, then please do look up my Patreon page, which will give you further information and allow you to donate monthly to this project, should you wish to do so. I would also like to add there that all of the content I ever make will always remain free for you to watch, so it's just purely an optional thing to help me out if you would like to do so. Again, thank you for watching.